What is that? Well, I have to wear it
Are you going to everybody? The Bears got cheated out of the win. The rest.
Basically livestock solo. Basically livestock solo.
I guess.
Exactly.
Well, I don't think I'm one person else do it. Not tomorrow.
Hey, I gave two of them some info, and the rest of you just sit back and don't touch.
I just look.
I'll get a very
Look.
Great day. Get up.
Oh, wow.
You got to give him your brother.
Where?
Oh my God. Right there behind your desk. Behind your desk, Eli. God. Oh my God.
Hey, get on my table.
Hey, Eli.
Man, it would have been just the last
Quick clarification on our exemption policy for December. We are sending out updated forms, so teachers will be getting those emails. You got the total and the senior option. So please take that down or do not display it. Because it'll play off where one will correct that. So the exemptions will be as follows in regards to the days. That's the only day that will not hold. And I have been.
In order to be easily identified, military musicians.
Will all field, those huge, unexcused, and unassessed will field. So the only days that will not carry against you towards are those that are officially marked. Thank you.
It don't matter. Let's say
I'm not taking what? I'm not taking
like, there's, I have to go
We've been five of them fucking week. But it just said.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please remain standing for a moment of silence.
asked you a question.
We have a couple of announcements this morning. Students, don't forget,
Jackson.
Thursday is teacher day. If you did not have your teacher made, Wednesday will be back Thursday. That includes seniors. That is everyone. Senior kids, get your made, get your picture made. Also, we are still doing the Kansas board. So bring your kids in to your 1 o'clock class. Everyone have a great day.
It's not bad if it isn't. They said those don't count.
The music of the revolution. I see. I'm not sure whether I like this music or I'm offended by it. We shall have to see how the rest of this day shakes out. Hello, I should introduce myself. I'm Benjamin Franklin, worldwide inventor, revolution, author, writer, printer. Oh, have you heard of my friend Johannes Gutenberg? He's really not my friend, but he has allowed me to do everything that I've done in my life so far
I thought you were George Washington.
with regards to printing and publishing and whatnot. Yes, my name is Benjamin Franklin. I only have one question for you. What year am I in? I don't even know. 1998. Oh, this is the era of your president, Clinton. Yes?
No.
Not Clinton.
No.
Where am I in?
No, you're Donald Trump. Our president Donald Trump in 19.
I set the Wayback Machine for 2013. Have I landed that? Have I landed in 2020?
2013.
2013. The height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is this correct?
No.
Oh, 2021. Thanks for playing along, guys. So first thing that I feel I need to do is turn off this ratchet music. Is that a word we still use? Ratchet? Is that a word we still use?
You're ratchet with all
I
the
can't
boxes.
handle these red coats on this newfangled light screen of yours. Where I come from, we still have to use candles. Okay, so to get this day started, I see that you have
Why are you going in and out of your accent?
an American. I got a little Johnny Depp, little Benjamin Franklin. I don't know if I figured it out yet. I see, all right, you're Jack Sparrow. I see that you have these notes in front of you, and I hear that you're in Revolutions Week, which is why I've been summoned from the past. So we're actually going to spend 2 days talking about the American Revolution. We are going to day one. Today we're going to talk about causes of the American Revolution. We're going to walk ourselves from the 1750s all the way up to that all-important year of revolution. What year was that?
1775.
Yeah, 75 and really 76. We're going to march ourselves all the way up to 1776. And you can see the spirit of revolutionary flag I have in the classroom. One of many early American flags. This was a potential candidate for the U.S. flag, was never adopted as official. But you can see the 76 is highlighted there because of how important the year 1776 was. So today we're going to look at causes of the revolution. Tomorrow, events of the revolution. That's 1776 on to essentially forming a new government. On the back of this page, you see people of the American Revolution. So you might have to do a little back and forth. Anytime we reference a person, I want you to write it on the back. But day one, kind of the top half of the page here. Day two, bottom half of the page. Both days, people of the revolution. And your second page is really going to help you with people. It's also just kind of a freebie additional handout. Really like this graphic. Some of my friends. Oh, yes, some of my good friends on this handout here. Before we even get started, I do have some special roles we need to assign. First, I'm about to spin the wheel for 5. This is the Jack Sparrow. I'm about to spin the wheel for 5 different positions. We're going to have 2 tax collectors, and tax collectors will represent each half of the room. Okay, I'm just going to split you down the middle. Tax collectors will represent half the room. We're going to spin the wheel for 2 members of Parliament. Parliament is that English, British Congress, right? What you might call Congress today. England has Parliament. That's actually what they still call it to this day. We're going to spin the wheel for 2 members of parliament, kind of representing each half of the room. Young man, your name, please. Oh, okay. That's your ability to update it. Thank you for pointing that out and refresh my old friend. So I will add old, what's his name over there? He still didn't tell me his name. And then we are going to spin our 5th position will be for the king. And you will be scorned and hated and probably have things thrown at you over the course of this lesson. But you will be the king. So let me add young Timothy to the wheel here.
Can't Eli be the king? No, I want to throw stuff. No, I want to What are we gonna
All right, drum roll, please, for the tax collectors. Drum roll. Tax collector number 1.
Oh,
Colin. Colin, go ahead and situate yourself over here. Sorry. As tax collector number 1. Ladies up front, I may have you change to the seats that get vacated. All right, remove. Tax collector number 2. Everybody boo for Colin. Boo! I don't like tax collectors.
He's gonna make out pay it. Check his throat.
What ain't that nobody?
Right.
Bryce.
Bryce, Monsieur Ray, you want to swap the seats with Ray? Ray, you'll be the tax collector number 2 over here.
Now I gotta move for Ray.
Remember, everybody boo for Ray. You're his friend. Like you're his only friend. So, all right, members of parliament, here we go.
Who is on board? Please. You're the king? Yeah. I'll be the king.
Gracie is a member of parliament. Gracie, can you situate a desk over there? Just grab one of the vacant desks. Kind of making this up as a
So
note.
they just rich.
Yes, I'm going to elaborate on all of this, but we got to get our positions selected to start the class. One more member of parliament. May. Booze for May. Boo. May, you can grab one of these desks and just come to this side since Grace shows that side. All right, and do you want to be king or not want to be king?
I want to be king.
Julie wants to be king because the kingship comes with the crown.
Oh, good.
Heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? All right. Nope. The wheel will pick it so no one hates you. Here we go.
Legalize that sacred skull.
Yeah, I can still in
Who shall it be?
Oh.
Queen Jayla. King Jayla. Come on up, Jayla. King, queen, monarch, whatever. I bequeath you the Halloween. I bequeath you the Halloween crown. Okay, so we are situated with our players for the day. Now, tax collectors, parliament, you do need to be taking notes. So if you boo for Jayla, boo for everybody at this point.
It's called the revolution. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't even know what we're doing.
If you need so hey, those of you that are up here, if you need a clipboard, you can deal with that. You just so we are on. Jayla has a good question. She wasn't here yesterday. She said, "What we do yesterday?" Yesterday, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't exactly matter. We are on to this next revolution, which is the American Revolution. Now, our setup here, I think we have a fun day ahead of us. We got to let me get through some big content right as we go. I'm not looking for perfect notes being taken word for word, but when I reference an event, usually they're kind of pulled out in its own color. Okay, usually, but you guys are smart enough to, if it's an event, if it's a tax, if it's an act, that is something I need you to write down. Write down the name of it and a brief description of it. Brief meaning not verbatim every word you see on the slide. I can go back at the end of the class. I will post it to Google Classroom. This newfangled thing you have called Google Classroom. I'll post it to Google Classroom, and of course you can go back and get your stuff from there. So my 5 players, you're gonna come into it. You're gonna have a role about the middle of the class, but I do have you up front so that people can boo at you at appropriate times. So here we go with causes of the American Revolution. Now, the first thing we have to understand, this is a little outside of our conversation, but we have to understand that we are on the heels of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War, we actually see big personalities like George Washington fight in a red coat. He fights on behalf of the British because those who have come from the old world to the new in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, they are British subjects. They are proud British subjects. They have no problem representing the crown and wearing what you guys probably understand to be a red coat or a lobster back. And we see that as the enemy, right? You watch sweet movies like The Patriot, and the guys wearing red are the bad guys. What we got to understand as a starting point is American colonists started out as proud British subjects. So coming off the heels of the French and Indian War, what we have is your 13 American colonies represented in red. France owns what you see in blue, and this is like the setup to your Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase and such. That's because France owns what is in blue, the center of your United States. And then we even have some Spanish territory. We know that Florida is strongly Spanish, and there's a strong Spanish heritage in Florida to this day. So this is kind of the setup of where we're going. And you got to understand the geography before we even get started. Colonial clashes in these early days. So the Ohio River Valley, just listen to this one. Okay, just listen to this one. The Ohio River Valley becomes a really contended area. These days, not too many people are going crazy for real estate in Cleveland, right? We're not fighting over Cleveland or Cincinnati today. But at the time, the Ohio River Valley was seen as lush and luxurious and good for farming. And there was clashes between the British and the French over Ohio. So we just got to understand that. Ohio is beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And at this time, British colonies have been constricted to the east of the Appalachian Mountains, and they really want to go over the mountains and through the woods, right? They want to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. George Washington is among those who speculate into the Ohio River Valley. He's considering investing money and settling in the Ohio River Valley. And actually, at one point, George Washington fights battles on behalf of the British in the Ohio River Valley. So this is the setup to the future clash that we're going to have, which you know as the American Revolution. Summer of 54, George Washington is sent into Ohio country, and he has two big battles, one at Fort Duquesne, and then one hit his little ramshackle fort called Fort Necessity. It's called that because he needed to build it, right? He cobbles together some sticks and some stones and some walls real quick, called Fort Necessity. So all that to say, George Washington once fought on behalf of the crown wearing a lobster back coat, and that is something that not a lot of people really think about when we talk about the father of our country. The end of the French and Indian War results in something called the Proclamation of 1763, and what we have is, for the first time in 50 years, the British Empire is at peace. We've kind of talked about the old world and the new world, and as the British Empire tries to conquer all around the world, they've been at constant war. Well, for the first time in 50 years, England is at peace. What we have is this dividing line, the strong red line right here, called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But because of all this fighting, the crown, J-Lo, you may be the king, you may be the monarch, but you are cash poor. You are in large debt. The empire itself is in large debt because of all the consistent fighting. Most of this fighting that happened in the Americas was seen to be on behalf of the American colonists. Well, by gosh, if we fought to protect them, they probably ought to pay us back. This is the setup to some taxes we're about to talk about. This is the setup to why the British Crown believed that they could tax the American colonists. So increased taxation of the colonies was seen as justified. After all, the British Empire, had been fighting on behalf of the colonists. So we left our homes in England. We came across the sea. Yeah, we settled this area, and there's plenty of reasons why we want your raw goods. But we fought on behalf of you, And by gosh, it's your turn to pay us back. This is where we arrive at in the 1760s. This proclamation of 1763, here's a line, the colors here show it pretty well. So red are these colonies. Lighter pink, this is west of the Appalachian Mountains, and this is pretty much Indian country at this point. And then yellow represents Spain. Well, the proclamation of 1763 draws a line along the Appalachian Mountains, and we see, let's just make context for you right here. We reside right about here, kind of right on the proclamation line, right, just east of it. And what this proclamation does is forbids you from traveling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Big question for you. How would you feel if the president today told you where you are and aren't allowed to travel? How'd you feel about that?
I would impeach him.
You would impeach him? Here's my proclamation. You may not get on an airplane and go visit your family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever, that you have in, I'll just pick an extreme example, California. You may not go visit your family in California. How do you feel about that? So the take here is, if my example didn't work for you, Colin, the take here is that the colonists were a little bit upset. They were getting told where they could and could not travel. Now, not to get too political and too present day, but you could probably grab some comparisons about the government telling you where you can and can't travel. You may go here, you may not go there, stay at home for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, right? Kind of some relevant present day context of the government telling you where you can and can't travel. This was more or less the setup here as well. Colonists who felt free, who felt like they had the right to go and explore wherever they wanted to, were being told, this is the line. You shall not cross west of the Appalachian Mountains. So what this did is it allowed England to control westward expansion. Expansion would be led and regulated and on the terms of the British. And as a side note, most Indian tribes, they actually did like this. This being Indian country, and they being the original settlers as it was, they were finally like, those white people that have come from the old world, all of a sudden they can't impede upon our lands. This leads to the Indians, the Native Americans, actually tending to side with the British throughout this conflict. They saw that the British were protecting Indian lands, and they're going to go on to fight as redcoats, or however you need to say it. The Indians tended to side with the British throughout the whole conflict here. So we're setting the stage for conflict. I want you to think of us as marching towards 1776. And a lot of these instances we're about to talk about are going to show dates. And if they're in the 60s or if they're in the early 70s, I want you to think that we're marching towards 1776. Big results here are that the proclamation line, it generally failed. Even though the Crown tried to draw the line and tried to enforce it, a lot of colonists were still going to do what they wanted to do, right? If they wanted to explore into the Ohio River Valley, there really wasn't a whole lot of checkpoints set up that were going to stop them. There wasn't a whole lot of traffic regulation. They could easily find, one of many passes over the Appalachian Mountains. So they did continue to go west and swarm over the Appalachian Mountain line into the Ohio River Valley. So all told, it wasn't a super successful proclamation in terms of being enforced, but nonetheless, it starts to establish the British Crown trying to strong-arm the colonists, restrict their freedoms, and we are setting the stage for a bunch of angry people to rebel against that very idea. Here's one of the first actions that actually tries to collect money to repay the war debt. Remember? So that the setup here is we fought on behalf of you. We are in debt because of that. You, colonists, must figure out how to pay us back. One of the first actions, this is an event that you should write down, is the Sugar Act of 1764. What's going on here is that the sugar is a raw good that's coming from the New World, right? You talked about your old triangular trade. You see how the old world and the New World swap manufactured goods for raw goods. Sugar being one of the raw goods that comes from the colonies, but some colonists were engaged in an illegal sugar trade with the French and Spanish West Indies. Your present-day Bahamas, Haiti, Dominican Republic for that matter, right? I like the sugar, or excuse me, the British like the sugar that are in the colonies, but by gosh, if they're going to trade with anyone but me, they're going to trade with the British Crown only. This is your attitude, the Queen Jayla. But some colonists were doing an illegal sugar trade, so we gotta crack the whip and have a Sugar Act tax. It strengthens enforcement, and it also increases the tax on sugar grown in the colonies. So get into a lot of economics here. You're basically hurting American sugar growers, sugarcane growers. So one more thing that's going to start to cause the grumbles amongst the colonists is the Sugar Act here. Now, as a positive side, anyone found guilty of breaking the Sugar Trade Act was at least tried in American courts. And by American, I mean colonial courts. So one thing the Crown did not do is say you have to go back to England to stand trial. They did at least establish courts in the colonies, and even though people are accused of crimes, at least they're able to stay local and stand trial local. We're going to see that change in the future, and that's going to be its own source of trouble. So, Sugar Act, 1764. Do some math for me. How far away are we from the Declaration of Independence? 12 years. All right, we're marching towards 1776, declaring independence. We're about 12 years away from that. There's another one, the Currency Act. At this time, colonists have been printing their own currency, money. Every colony kind of had a different currency. So you had currency from Georgia, currency from South Carolina. Yeah, there were some issues with could you spend currency across state lines, all that. But what the currency allowed colonists to do was have an identity. I am from Georgia. I am printing my own currency. We are Georgian, and this is a part of our identity. Well, the Currency Act forbid colonists from issuing their own paper money, required that they turn it over, cease printing, cease the circulation of it. So, one, this is a power grab from the Crown. It is consolidating colonial identity to being under the Crown, and it is another example of how the Crown is reaching its spiny, ugly, long fingernailed hands into colonial business, and we have colonists who are going to be angry because of it. Now, I'll draw a distinction here. Some colonists who disapproved of this type of overreach and were in favor of rebellion, they are called patriots. That's I think that's a common word in your 2021. You have a baseball team called the Patriots or something like that? Football. I've not heard of this football yet. But okay, you have a professional sports team called the Patriots. Patriot. We're familiar with that word. The other side here are those that actually didn't have a problem with what England was doing. They are called loyalists. They are remaining loyal to the Crown. And all the things I'm talking about here, a certain part of the population being loyalists, they actually were not, they were in favor of what the Crown was doing. They wanted to stay British subjects. They did not think it was worth fighting over, dying over. Hey, we got a good thing going on with Queen Jayla, King George III. So why would we fight against them? So there are two sides to the conversation here, patriots versus loyalists. Anytime I talk about the seeds of rebellion or people who are getting angry about these various acts and taxes, we are talking about the patriots. You got to keep in mind there's a whole other group of people that are kind of in favor of all of this going on, and they don't want to break away from the Crown. Currency Act, one more step closer to 1776. Well, how did the colonists respond to all this? Big idea, naturally they resented these new regulations. That's the patriot side of things. But they did also continue to be at odds with each other. We still have state divisions, right? We have currencies from 13 different locations. So let's not play like there's this big unified United States of America yet. Colonists are still griping with each other as well. There's the more cityscape up north. There's the more agriculture-based down south. And then there are those that even go across that proclamation line. They're considered backcountry, woodsmen, frontiersmen. So we have distinctly different attitudes and personalities even in this same colonial empire, colonial government. And this is, you might say, right, I'm getting way ahead of my Benjamin Franklin self here, but you might say this is the beginning of sectionalism. we have different sections of the country. And if I'm a thinking man, if I'm a guessing man, I might think that in the 1860s or so, you guys are going to have even more trouble with sectionalism. And I would argue it kind of starts here, even 100 years earlier. Your American Civil War kind of has its roots in these different sections, North, South, backwoods, and the different personalities that come with each. A little bit more colonial response. There's a group called the Paxton Boys. They are just kind of a backwoods militia. They threaten violence. They threaten bloodshed if these imperial monarch regulations are not dealt with. You might be a little bit more familiar with the so-called Sons of Liberty. Paxton Boys and the Regulator movement, they're kind of a forerunner to the Sons of Liberty. A little bit more aggressive, a little bit more violent, and because and also a little bit less famous. It's the Sons of Liberty that go on to gain a little bit more fame. So small, a small little personality here. You might slap this on people, the Paxton Boys, the Regulators. We will talk about the Sons of Liberty as well. So just kind of a forerunner to, sometimes the famous history, the stuff they make movies about, isn't the whole history. So I want to point out to you that there are other rebel groups other than just the so-called Sons of Liberty that seem to get a little bit more fame and recognition. The Stamp Act. Here we have another one, 1765. Now, when I say stamp, what do you think about?
Paper.
Paper, okay. How do you use stamps in the world today?
On my
Postal
service.
You guys think the postage stamp, right? When I was your age, I think it was like 32 cents a stamp. These days, what is it, like 56 cents a stamp or something like that? And some of you are like, stamps, envelopes, what's that? Haven't you heard of email? You guys tend to think of a postage stamp. So the Stamp Act here requires kind of the same idea of a stamp, but it's not just for letters. It is for every single piece of legal paper that is sold inside of the colonies. So if you wanted to sell a newspaper, stamp. If you wanted to have a charter for a tavern, you'd have stamp on that paper. If you wanted to run a bookshop, stamps on those papers. If you wanted to sell, the buying and selling of goods and the paper receipts that come from that, stamp. And what we're talking about is that little moving image at the bottom, kind of a wax/ink stamp onto this paper. And the tax is that you're paying for the stamp, but you also couldn't legally do business without the stamp. So in order to do legal business that involved paper, every single sheet of paper had to have this stamp on it. Now, the picture you see here with the skull and crossbones, this is not one of the official stamps from the crown. This is kind of a mock of that stamp. This is saying that this Stamp Act is basically like death to the colonies. That's why you have the skull and crossbones. This next picture here are some of the actual stamps. And you can see it's kind of a penny stamp, right? Some of them have the price labeled on it. You can see it's kind of regal. It's got that crest. You might say almost like a family crest or a royal crown crest. These are some I'm a nerd for primary sources. I'm talking as Swanson, not Franklin here. I'm fascinated by these pictures because these are the actual stamps that would have been on Stamp Act papers. A little bit more about the Stamp Act. What else I got here? So this is really setting the stage for some vocal opposition. You got the Paxton Boys, you got the Regulators, you got various groups threatening violence. Well, now we have colonial governments starting to have conversations and starting to talk about the injustices that are coming from across the ocean, coming from King George. Real famous one is Patrick Henry. He was an elected member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. You see that there in yellow. What is Patrick Henry famous for? Anybody? Top of your head here?
No taxation, not representation.
Not Patrick Henry. I will tell you who that's my friend James Otis. We'll talk about him in a second. Patrick Henry had a real iconic statement that is along those same lines, young Padawan, but not exactly no taxation. Anybody else? Patrick Henry?
Wasn't he? Oh, it was give me liberty.
There it is. My friend Patrick Henry gives this, emphatic speech in which he says, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that is in response to these early tax acts that are being imposed upon the colonies. So I don't know about you. When I was younger, this was Swanson. When I was younger, I thought "give me liberty or give me death" was like right on the cusp of war. Clearly, there's some great injustices that have been happening. Everyone's ready to go to war. It's actually way earlier than that. It was just these couple of tax acts that led Patrick Henry to say, give me liberty or give me death. So you can see how much people felt that the crown was reaching into their personal lives, reaching into their economic lives, and they are literally willing to go to, their dying blows. Give me death if we cannot have liberty. So Patrick Henry, famous Virginian, give me liberty or give me death. He is one of those sons of liberty. So let's talk about the Sons of Liberty. Sons of Liberty formed in Boston, Massachusetts in 1765. Okay, so they are a little bit more to the north than the Paxton Boys and the North Carolina Regulators. Sons of Liberty, I'm going to use some powerful language here. Sons of Liberty were a terrorist organization of colonists. The reason I say they are terrorists is because they used the actions they took upon civilians was to gain was politically motivated. We'll talk about terrorism here in just a second. You guys tend to think that a terrorist has to be foreign, a terrorist has to be religiously motivated, whichever religion that may be. That's not the case. These Sons of Liberty, who are just as white and Caucasian and colonial as you and I, as most of us here today, these Sons of Liberty were terrorists. So there's not a skin color, there's not a religion that fits the idea of terrorism. We'll talk about terrorism here in just a second. Sons of Liberty, the picture you see here is a picture of them. Raise your hand if you're a tax collector. Colin and Ray. The Sons of Liberty are tar and feathering these tax collectors. Colin, Ray, you are so hated that you would be corralled, detained illegally, right? Because the Sons of Liberty were not an official organization, or they weren't a government organization. And they would pour tar on your body, hot tar, and then feathers all over you. And actually, so there's no photographs from this time period. There are tar and feathering did continue into the age of photography. And there are some pretty gruesome photos out there of people who've been tarred and feathered. This isn't like, ha, 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 I'm going to throw you in the hot tub and it's going to be a joke. This is legitimately the scarring of skin, the burning of skin. And when you throw the feathers onto that hot tar and the tar hardens and seals, like you got open sores, you got things stuck to your skin. And as the skin regrows, sometimes it would regrow over the feathers stuck to that tar. And some individuals, victims of tarring and feathering, have feathers in their body until to their dying day. So tarring and feathering was not, it's not like toilet papering someone's house. It is genuinely a crime to someone's body, health, and well-being. And that is why the Sons of Liberty deservedly are called a terrorist organization. TJ?
I just wanted to put a little bit of knowledge on the picture you had up
Please.
I've seen it because we have an old social studies book from the 80s in my house.
Okay.
I was flipping through it, and that pictures, and it was talking about how that was drawn by a British, by a loyalist.
Okay.
And he deliberately drew the Sons of Liberty in an ugly tone.
TJ makes a great point. And TJ, I'm going to elaborate on a couple more drawings here as we go. Who draws, like the author, the source of any primary source matters. And TJ's right. The Sons of Liberty here are drawn in kind of a devious, almost like evil or maniacal kind of a position here, showing a seemingly innocent tax collector from the British perspective being assaulted, tarred, and feathered. And then what are they doing? What are they putting into his mouth there? Can you tell that?
And a hot tea.
Hot tea, yeah. So it's a pot of tea, kind of the iconic shape of a teapot. And that is in response to the Tea Act, which we haven't quite talked about yet. But since they're taxing the tea, these tax collectors are having hot tea poured down their throat. So altogether, a pretty uncomfortable experience. And like I said, not really a joke, not just a prank, definitely a crime against the health of these tax collectors. So Colin, Ray, you ready? Are you ready for it? Our next simulation will be, I'm just kidding, we're not going to simulate tarring and feathering. Now, I mentioned the Sons of Liberty as a terrorist organization. Since this is an honors class, I think we can handle this the depth of this conversation. So I'm going to do this real quick. The definition of terrorism is as such: the use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. So with that definition in mind, we can see that the September 11th, 2001 attacks against America fit terrorism, violence against civilians to achieve political aims. But we can also take this to the Sons of Liberty in the 1760s and 70s and see that they used violence against civilians. Okay, it was not a military versus military conflict yet in the pursuit of political aims. So by the definition, the Sons of Liberty, who a lot of times we hold up as great men and patriots and fighters against tyranny, actually they fit the definition of terrorism. So maybe that's something for you to chew on, something for you to struggle with a little bit. Are we a country born out of terrorist actions? Is that good or bad? I'll leave you with that question. The Townsend Acts. So here is I give you another event and I give you another person. The Townsend Acts, those are an event, and Charles Townsend is the person that you need to write down. He's British. He's the new British Secretary of the Treasury. And he enacts a series of taxes and acts that just go on to rattle the colonists in a big way along the lines of all these things. So the first one is the Quartering Act, and this requires colonists to provide food and quarters, housing for British troops. So Fabian, the Hernandez family is getting ready to go to sleep tonight, right? They're blowing out their candles. They've already had their dinner. Maybe there's a little food left on the kettle stove, right? Knock, knock, knock. British troops at the door. Excuse me, Hernandez family. We'll be requiring these quarters for the next week. And Fabian's family has no choice under the Quartering Act but to move out and give their house and their provisions, their supplies, especially if there was animals and crops available on their family land. This is what the Quartering Act required. This obviously, I hope I can say the word obviously. This would irk or frustrate many colonists because the Hernandez family just want to go to sleep. They've already had their dinner. Maybe they're saving a little extra for the next day. But all of a sudden, these British troops are kicking them out of their house, and they're going to eat them out of house and home. They're probably going to take some of their animals and whatever crops they have available. So the British see this as repayment for the fighting that's already happened in the colonies. Of course, the colonists see this as a big invasion of their personal space and privacy. And just kind of an imposition upon their personal freedoms. This is the precursor to our Third Amendment today. The Third Amendment in the Bill of Rights requires that no American has to house and quarter troops. Not exactly a big problem that we have today. It's not like the National Guard knocks on houses and says, hey, can we stay here tonight? That's not how it works today. We don't have this problem anymore. But because of the Townsend Act and the Quartering Act, we felt because it was so fresh in our memory at the time of writing our new government, our Third Amendment is actually, against the housing and quartering of soldiers. Townsend duties, he goes on to impose taxes on 4 bigs: lead, paint, paper, and tea. The most famous of which is probably the Tea Act, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's got big consequences. But the Townsend duties are a tax on 4 bigs: lead, paint, paper, and tea. Here you have a picture of British troops just coming in and kicking people out, right? You got women, children, elderly, but the British troops say, not today. Like, this is our house for tonight. And it really wasn't usually just one night. It was a lengthy period of time. A little more on the Townsend Act. So Townsend, he doesn't call them big actions. He calls them external taxes, right? He tries to play it down. Call them what you want. They had the same effect as a tax, and they definitely frustrated colonists in the same way as a tax. And you might say that's like putting lipstick on a pig because they were basically a tax. So Townsend can try to dumb it down however he wants. They were definitely a tax. Here's the colonists' response to the Townsend Acts and duties. This is let me talk through this because there's kind of a big sequence of events here. The Massachusetts of Assembly circulates a letter of opposition. It would be like, hang on just a second. Everybody wants to talk. Oh, we opened the time portal. No, we don't have any kids. Hello, Officer Smith. I love you. Officer Smith. Hey, my name's Benjamin. Last name Frank. Thanks, nice to meet you. Hey, Bill, time traveling.
Hey, that's a boy, sabe se dá porque como do sabe. Lá boy, sabe se dá cowboy.
Okay.
Call him.
Good. I'm coming.
Okay, all right, hey, does everybody know Officer Smith? My friend Officer Smith. So if anybody gives you any trouble in this school, you call Officer Smith, all right?
I'm coming.
Okay, go call backup. Call backup. Officer Smith.
All right.
Shake my hand. Yes, sir. How about there it is? All right. Thank you. They got spooked when I opened the time portal. I'll try to explain this briefly. Massachusetts Assembly, they write a letter almost like a precursor to the Declaration, signed by multiple men, right? Signed by the whole Assembly. This letter actually doesn't get much impact around the rest of the colonies until the British acknowledge it. They say, hey, this letter that's coming out of Massachusetts, we denounce this letter. At that time, all of a sudden, this letter got more attention, got more traction around the rest of the colonies. So it's almost like if the British had not mentioned this letter in the first place, it might have died. It might not have gotten a lot, much more popularity. But because the British acknowledged it, you ever done that? You got a problem in your life, and maybe it'll just die away if you don't keep talking about it. But you just got to keep talking about it, and all of a sudden it becomes, I don't know, gossip, or it just becomes a bigger problem. I don't know. Maybe that analogy fits your life. Anyway, at this point, the Assembly then votes to affirm the letter. The letter gets published and distributed all around the colonies. Now it's a thing. Massachusetts is at the leading edge of revolution. And a lot of times that's why we consider Boston and the Sons of Liberty out of Massachusetts to be the leading edge of revolution. Yes, ma'am. The what? Oh, yeah, the out of the portalet is just, yeah, the outhouse is just outside. Go ahead. It's a little cold today, but just take blanket. Response to the Townshend Acts. The people did not like it, right? We the people. Yeah, go ahead, raise our taxes. We'll all come at you. Yeah. There were boycotts in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Boycotts of these big goods, right? The big four, what was it? Lead, paint, tea, and paper. Boycotts of these products. Like I said, the most famous of which is tea, and we're gonna have ourselves a little party over tea boycotts here in just a little bit. Well, guess what? Townshend, the man, the picture I showed you a little earlier, lipstick on a pig, he suddenly dies in England. He suddenly dies, and his replacement repeals these taxes, right? So you might say that the whole issue is over. Here's a nice little image on what the taxes are, kind of a cute little craft. We're not going to make this today. Tea, paint, lead, paper, glass, that was also in there as well. Townshend suddenly dies. His replacement repeals these taxes. But you know what? It wasn't in time to make a difference to the seeds of rebellion that have already been planted. I'll pause there. Let's go the short way to the restroom. Come back. And when we come back, my big five, this is where we're going to do our activity where you have a roll. Woo!
But what is in the?
Can I wear that?
Hey, did you ever go back to this? You're the one that
Julia asked me to ask.
Oh, Julia's getting you to do her dirty work? I got you.
Yes.
I got you.
Anybody you want.
It's the right to cover their government. No, it's the Second Amendment. Yes, but. Who cares? This is for political. Put that on the end of the gun.
All right. I know, so I did a lot of talking up front. I have set the stage. Benjamin Franklin has set the stage for. No, you can leave it alone. Do about it. I've set the stage for an activity here that I think is going to show you just how frustrating all these taxes and acts may have been to the colonists. So first, I need my tax collectors to actually be tax distributors. What I want you to do is give 1 cup of these things to everybody. Okay, 1 cup of these things. So here's what we have. We have Skittles, regular M&Ms, and then caramel M&Ms. What Matt? So I couldn't find a package of candy that had 28 of the same items. Okay. So what we're dealing with is different candies. But what actually matters is the color of your items. So when you get your cup, open it and dump your items in your cup. We should all have about 10 or 11 candies. You know that's what comes in the package here. So tax collectors, first of all, be tax distributors. Tax collectors, first be tax distributors. You mean Queen?
I'll take a
There you go. Yep, I hear the candy going clink. That is good. That is good.
I got
Should have some extra.
I missed it. How do I miss it? You were in class.
Hey, if you got the blue package, raise your hand. I'm giving you an extra just based on, well, you only need 1 Trinity.
Hey, Mom's happy.
You got the blue package, I'm going to give you an extra just because based on quantity.
I would not put that back.
All right, are we set up? Tax collector, come on
Mrs.
back.
Johnson, hold on.
No trading. Your allotted income is what you got. So what you're holding, represented by the candies, what you're holding, represented by the candies, is your family fortune. This is your income. This is how much money you have. Now, tax collectors, open yours as well. Tax collectors, you got yours open. You're actually collecting taxes. The way you're going to go to Right. This is your So first things first, we have. Did you not get one, Landon? Now, hey, I'm throwing some extra candies at the caramels just because I guess there weren't quite as many in there. Get situated for the game here. So first things first, obviously I'm going to give the queen a double set because she deserves more than the rest.
Look how she looks. She broke.
The queen is going to get a double set because she deserves more than the rest. You know, Gracie says that's not fair, and the queen says tough crackers. She is the crown. Obviously, she's going to get double. Now, tax collectors, raise your hand for tax collectors. You guys are going to be active. I need you to work kind of rapidly here. So go ahead, stand up. I'm in the advisor room, just right here. This is Collins Tax Collection District. This is Ray's Tax Collecting District. First things first. Any red candy you have comes back to the crown. So tax collectors, go collect all the red candies. All the red candies. Collecting into your extra cup. All red candies come back to the crown.
Ain't that right?
All
red candies.
Hey, if you get any resistance from the people, you got permission to rough them up a little bit.
Hurry up, Tyler.
Don't you even think about it, commoners. Don't you even think about giving any resistance.
Hey, yes, sir.
And tax collectors, don't forget your own reds. You gotta give your own reds to the crown as well. She says, ha ha ha. Ha ha ha.
Hey, man.
Rapido, come on. All right. I see a red. Why are you keeping a red? Hey, you better go. I want to keep an eye on this. You're eating this. So the tax collectors are returning all red candies to the crown. Red for Royal, red for England. All the red candies are returned to the
Actually, that's
crown.
supposed to be purple.
All the red candies. No, in England it's red. In England it's red.
No,
You guys grumpy yet? What? Delaney, why are you not paying taxes?
Lady, how dare you?
She gets some broke. You didn't have any red.
Exactly.
All right, tax collectors, on your feet, on your feet. So the next tax that will be levied, pay attention. If you have holes in your jeans, you owe free candy. Don't jump on that one. Excuse you. You know what? Take 4 from her. Hey, you're supposed to be on her side. You're a colonist. Colonists got to stick together, right?
I gotta make some. She might be a lawyer.
Tax collectors, when you're done, come back up front. When you're done, come back up front. The Queen would like to say that any resistors deserve death. So, in the example of the day is Alex. All right, check it out. Tax collectors, take one for yourselves. Go ahead and take one out of your collection. Take one for yourselves.
One.
Please, you're a tax collector. Take one extra. No, for yourself. From the bucket you just collected, the tax collectors, they get one extra. Right? Now, Parliament, tax collectors give 2 to Parliament. Parliament needs some of this tax money to run the empire. So Parliament, they didn't do. May, did you do anything? You're just sitting here, right? Yeah, but you just got 2 extras. So Parliament, Gracie and May, they just got some extras. And you know what? Now give the rest to the king. Give the rest to the crown.
Hang on.
Oh, the Queen has a proclamation.
I thought you played school sport. I want 10
If you play a school sport, and you know who that is, tax collectors, if you play a school sport, no one's retired from school sport. Tax collectors, that does include yourselves.
Okay, that's the only time band counts.
The band counts. She has declared the band counts.
Does it have to be in high school?
All the time.
Queen does
Hey,
not be a high
you
school
don't
sport.
want to give it away. Is it like your any sport you want to play at school?
If you've ever worn a Red Raiders jersey or uniform for any reason, how many we got? You know what, tax collectors? Why don't you keep 2 for yourself? Keep 2 for yourself. Tax collectors get to keep 2 this time. Yeah, Trinity Kennedy, I'm pretty sure these are your two that raise keepers.
Hey!
Tax collectors give 3 to Parliament. 3 to Parliament. And then the rest of the crown. Okay. Hey, Queen, how we feeling? Pretty, let's rattle that around a bit. Woo! That Queen got some candy. Some candy. Yeah, it sounds really empty out there. It's full right here. Hey, Queen Jayla, I'm wondering if you have another tax in mind. Look it up.
You go to church.
What?
Ooh, a religious tax. Now, hey, you better be honest. You better be honest.
What did she say?
If you go to church,
I only go to church.
it's a religious tax if you go to church, too.
I seriously don't go to church.
We got already go to church.
Tax collectors, you better regulate. You better know your people. Tax collectors are in charge.
I'm a beat up.
Good job.
Tax collectors, once you keep yourselves, they'll steal off the top. Hey, that's free. I can count on when I watch the tax collectors. Once you get 2 to Parliament, tax collectors, 2 for yourselves, 2 for Parliament, and the rest to the Queen. The rest to the Queen, the crown. Man, we got a bunch of people that all of a sudden don't go to church in this room.
Hurry up, man.
Raise the kind tax collector. It'd be real hard to tar each other right here. Alright, 2 for yourself, 2 for Parliament, and the rest of the Queen. Here's some empty cups out the cheap seat. Pretty empty cups out the cheap seat. What do you think, Crown? You got enough? You got enough to pay for more? Now, hang on. Why was the Crown taxing the colonies?
Because she was in debt from all the wars.
In debt from all the wars. Yes. Hey, Queen Jayla. I'm going to show everybody. Look what the Queen's got. Look what the Crown's got. Parliament, hold yours up. You got more than the average bear. You been eating some? What do you think, Queen Jayla? Do we have enough? Are we out of debt yet?
No, we need more.
We need some more. All right, why don't you levy one more tax?
Hey, you have a book bag. What
If you have a book bag, a backpack, a purse, whatever, you have a bag, 2 candies. You have a bag, 2 candies. Woo, we got a bunch of criminals. We got a bunch of people trying to hide their book bags. Colin, are you an inaccurate, unfaithful tax collector?
Hey, he's old.
What you gonna do? Come after the Queen?
I'm out.
Wow, you guys are straight up broke folks. Broke folks.
Man, you got a good back here. Give me your money.
Trying to hide their backpacks over there. All right, last tax collection. Let's wrap it up. Let's go.
I think some people have been paying the tax.
I think this tax collection is one cup.
Some people have been paying the tax.
have anything, you can put
Shoot up.
indentured servitude. Hey, two for yourself, two for Parliament. Tax collectors, go ahead, take your seats. Let's not miss the point. Okay, I amped us up. Now bring it back down for me. Let's make the big points here. So, Queen Jayla, how many did you start out with? How many packages of candy did you start out with?
One.
Two. She started out with 2 packages of candy. She is a queen. She started out with 2. So that's about 20 to 22 items, right? 20 to 22 items. Hold up your big tape now. Woo! Jayla, she got a whole cup worth of candy.
And she's been eating.
Well, and she's been eating some. So, in classic Monarch fashion, she's been definitely skimming off the top as she goes. Now, everybody else started with 1 package. And even if you started with the combo 2, let's consider that 1 package. Everybody started with about 10 to 12 to 13, right? If you have fewer than 3 after all the taxation, hold your cup up. Fewer than 3. 3, 2, 1, or 0. Hold it up.
Allie, you got 0, right?
What?
Allie, what happened?
I got 4.
Oh, okay then. You say good started.
So we got a couple that have 3 or fewer. Let's go with, 6. All the way up to 6. 6, 5, or 4. 6, 5, or 4. 9. 9, 8, 7. Okay. So raise your hand if you finished with more than you started with. Oh, nobody in the cheap seats finished with more than they started with.
Of course you did.
Right? The big 5 up here, they finished with more than they started with, so nobody else did. So now, hey, there was some gameism going on, right? Colin somehow lost his whole take at some point. I saw some colonists behaving with shady behavior. Bryce, what were you doing? Bryce said, I don't have a backpack, right? I'm trying to hide the backpack. How many of you all of a sudden changed your church membership? Right? Some of you all of a sudden didn't attend church anymore. Hey, I picked that one on purpose because we kind of couldn't prove that. Much like the tax collectors, they might go around collecting taxes, say that you do or don't go to church. He's going to collect the tax based off of his force, right? So let me ask you this. What was so unfair about how the class was taxed?
It was stereotypical.
Stereotypical? Okay, I like that. What else? How could it have been handled more fairly?
Mrs. Morrison. I dropped the scale. I gave it to Gerardo.
You know what? God made dirt, dirt don't hurt. How could have this been handled more fairly?
Do a percentage instead of a set price because we all have people's different incomes.
Oh, okay. Okay, so Homer, we got a future congressman over here. He said, how about a percentage of your starting income, not just a set price? Because at a certain point, Allie could not afford any more taxes. Now, there might have been some lying going on there, I'm not sure. But, right, if someone still has 10 and someone else only has 3, but the tax is 2, it's not exactly fair across all classes. Let me ask you this. Can you now understand why tax collectors work hard and feathered?
Yeah.
Crowd, did you kind of get a little frustrated at our tax collectors here? I wanted to kill college, to put it succinctly.
What about
Right.
So don't miss it. The big idea here, your takeaway. I know I talked a lot for about 20 minutes. I told you about all the taxes that were levied on the colonists, and now I have showed you why they hate the crown, why they're cranky about Parliament, right? Parliament was skimming off the top, even though Parliament, you never interacted with Parliament, right? They're literally across the ocean in the real world, but they are still skimming off the top of your money. And then, yeah, definitely the colonists have reason to hate the crown and Parliament and the tax collector. So I hope you can see why colonists were ready to revolt. Did that kind of seal it in your brain? Can you see why colonists were ready to revolt? How about an emphatic yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Everybody return to your original seats. If you are lacking candy, you're lacking candy. Jayla is not one of those. Let me hook you up. Trying to make it fair to you, everybody.
I appreciate
Right around, I'm just tossing candy. Right around, I'm just tossing candy. Back to your original seat. I got a little more to get through.
I'll eat
Yes, nerds for a nerd. If you got nerds, because I think you are one. If you got nerds, it's because you are one. You gotta hold tight. Woo! All right, that was fun. I had fun with that. I hope you did as well. But let's we got to settle back down, get back to your papers. I'm going to finish out the story of the events, or rather the causes of the American Revolution. So you had a formative experience of why the colonists would hate the crown. Just like you hated Ray and Colin for the way they represented the crown. Just like you, just like you probably didn't appreciate Parliament getting off the top, and just like you really didn't appreciate Jayla's fat take of candy over here, Jayla be munching on this the rest of the day. You can probably feel the same type of frustration that the colonists had at this time. Well, so far, rebellion hasn't been bloody. So far, rebellion hasn't forced any fighting. Tar and feathering, okay, a little bit on the violent side, but we haven't pulled any triggers just yet. The first shots of the American Revolution come at what is called the Boston Massacre. Now, this is not the first organized military fight. We will talk about that tomorrow. But these are the first time shots are fired during this rebellion period. Boston, Massachusetts, remember this is the seat of rebellion. What happens here is that, I think Eric kind of said it, nobody really knows how the shots got fired. Nobody really knows who pulled the trigger first. As the story goes, on a snowy, cold, dark night, a group of colonists, frustrated, cranky, angry about all the taxes, everything we've talked about so far, they start having a little snowball fight with some British soldiers. But it wasn't your average snowball fight. It wasn't just children playing games. These colonists were packing bricks, rocks, and even glass, shards of glass, into these snowballs and throwing them at a formation of British soldiers. So they were kind of atomic snowballs, right? But Lily, you're trying to start a fight? Probably trying to start a fight. Well, what happens is, this is most likely what history believes happened. A group of young, relatively untrained and nervous British soldiers, they train their weapons on the colonists. They're a little nervous. Are we allowed to shoot? Are we not? Can I defend myself? What's going on here? All of a sudden, one shot does ring out. And from one shot, multiple shots ring out. And in the end, what we have are 5 dead American colonists and a bloodied, battered group and blood on the streets. What we have is now blood being shed in the name of freedom, independence, and revolution. Now, let me ask you this. 5 people dead. Is that a massacre?
No.
What does the word massacre usually imply?
12 or more.
Eric get very specific, 12 or more. I don't know if that's like the real line of the definition, but when we hear the word massacre, we generally think of massive bloodshed, right? An event that has multiple casualties and dead people. I don't want to belittle 5 people that died, but 5 people dying is not usually considered a massacre. But this is how it was phrased in the newspapers the next day and onward. It is called the Boston Massacre. What you see here, I'll go back one. This is the original wood etching drawing that was printed in papers. This is actually drawn by Paul Revere. You guys probably know him from the famous Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. But he was actually a printer. He was a printer as well. And what you can see here is his interpretation of what happened. British soldiers with their weapons trained at a clearly unhostile group of colonists, right? Ooh, we were just minding our own business and all of a sudden we're cut down in the streets. It's a massacre. This is how it was phrased. A little bit more of a modern rendering, but it does this more accurately shows how there was probably hostilities coming from both directions, a clash on both sides. So very interesting how the event is called a massacre, even though it was on the smaller side of bloodshed. But this begins, these are the seeds of rebellion being sowed. They, us versus them. They killed us. They massacred us. We're drawing battle lines. We got an us, we're the good guys. We got a them, they're the bad guys. And we're trying to paint the picture of how oppressed we are. This is the big takeaway of the Boston Massacre. The one person who was killed in the Boston Massacre is this man named Crispus Attucks. He is from, he's a blend of Native American and African American. Okay, mother was one, father was the other. So he really is kind of a bringing together of all these racial, the melting pot that will become America. He dies at the Boston Massacre. A lot of times he's considered the first person to die in the American Revolution. Was he the first of the 5 to die? We don't know. But his story becomes that same type of propaganda, right? Crispus Attucks, a Native American, African American freedman, dies on behalf of liberty at Boston Square. So Crispus Attucks, kind of a famous name that comes out of the Boston Massacre. What else I got here? The soldiers who fired upon the crowd were tried in a court of law. They're tried in a colonial court. They were found guilty of manslaughter. Now, to get a little technical with you, manslaughter means accidental death. If you're involved in a car accident and it wasn't really, it wasn't, you didn't mean to kill someone, but unfortunately there's a death, it might be called manslaughter. How it gets published in the papers, though, is as murder, right? So the charges were manslaughter. How it actually gets said in papers is that it was murder, and this just continues the spinning of colonial propaganda. Got to put myself on fast forward here a little bit. Committees of correspondence, pretty big deal. It was an action proposed by Samuel Adams, and you may know him today as the guy that has beer, Sam Adams beer. This is Sam Adams. He was a cousin to the second president of the United States, John Adams. So a lot of times you hear about the Adams, the Adamses of the Sons of Liberty. John was a lawyer and kind of a brainiac. Sam was a little bit more on the revolutionary and the action-oriented side. So Sam Adams, he starts the Committee of Correspondence. This is a letter-writing campaign. They are sending their letters to newspapers all around the colonies. They are trying to rally support for the cause of freedom, and essentially it was a propaganda campaign. I don't want to go so far as to say fake news, but they definitely exaggerated their position and the atrocities of the British. So they use propaganda, they use sensationalism. These days they would have been crushing it on Twitter and Instagram and with hashtags. This is what the Committees of Correspondence is. Sam Adams, maybe you can remember that because he has a beer company today. I'm gonna just pass this. So one of the big statements that comes out of the spirit of revolution is no taxation without representation. This comes from a lesser known name, James Otis. Okay, I don't know, these days we emphasize certain names like myself, Benjamin Franklin. James Otis kind of seems to be on the lost side of history, so I want to make sure you guys know. James Otis is the one who says the phrase, we should not accept, no taxation without representation. We should not be taxed in the colonies if we do not have representatives across the ocean in Parliament. Now, I believe the colonists would have been willing to settle for fair representation in Parliament. If the British government had said, you know what, you get a couple reps in Parliament, they can vote on your behalf, they can voice your opinion, your gripes, I think the colonists would have settled for that. But their biggest complaint was that they were being taxed, they were being oppressed, and they didn't even have a voice in Parliament. So that's a big piece of of what will become the revolution. Here's James Otis's actual quote: "Taxation without representation is tyranny." A lot of times we summarize that as no taxation without representation. Familiar with the movie The Patriot? This is a big rallying cry at one of the early scenes before the war scenes actually started. They are talking about taxation without representation. Last pass that a little bit. So it gets us to the Tea Act. Now the Townshend Act was a tax on tea. That is not the same as the later Tea Act. Tea Act of 1773. So how close are we to that big year now? It's about 3 years away from 1776. Early 1770s were on the quiet side, despite the things we've been talking about. It's committees of correspondence. It was on the quieter side of rebellion until the Tea Act comes about. So it's almost like the Brits, the Crown, Queen Jayla, it's almost like they could have kept things in check until they decided to go about taxing tea. Now, tea, you've got to understand, is about the equivalent of what today would be coffee, right? A lot of Americans can't live without their morning cup of coffee, and if coffee were all of a sudden to be, double the price or taxed at a greater price than it is currently, there'd be a lot of people upset about a coffee tax. That's what tea was at this time. Well, the British, they leveled this tea tax as an attempt to save the British East India Company. Okay, I'm not going to get into the complexities there, but the British East India Company was kind of on the verge of bankruptcy. And just one more example of, hey, let's abuse the colonies, let's tax the colonies in order to save the British East India Company. What they specifically do is tax tea, crates of tea, okay, not little tea bags, not that tea bag you put in your pot and it boils and it makes tea. They're taxing crates of tea, and this was a major economic import and export at the time. So it was a big deal to tax the tea. Like I said, you guys might not sell out and go to war over Lipton iced tea today, but at the time, tea was a very important product, so the tax was pretty significant. The British assumed the colonists would like the act. It actually lowered the cost of tea at home, but that's really not the point because it's just one other example of an unconstitutional tax. And the picture you see here, this is actually a recreation of Liberty Square this is at Disney World. And it's really cool that Walt Disney had a big emphasis on early American history. And he's really created a small little place inside of Disney World that really feels like the 1770s Boston. And they have these posted bills: stand tall with the Sons of Liberty, avoid the detested beverage, don't buy tea. So kind of a cool little place to visit if you ever get that chance. Overall, this leads to a boycott of tea. The boycott mobilized a revolutionary force, and all of a sudden, what once was regional, right? We got north, we got south, we got backwoods. All of a sudden, everyone is kind of linked together through this tax on tea, or rather the boycott on tea. And for the first time, I'm going to talk about women involved in the revolution. We have the Sons of Liberty. Did you also know we have the Daughters of Liberty, an organization called the Daughters of Liberty? So here's a group of people. It's led by a woman. This is her picture here, Mercy Otis Warren. She is actually the sister of Mr. No Taxation Without Representation. She's the sister of James Otis. So again, you have families kind of with the revolutionary spirit together. And what these women did, they didn't bear arms, they didn't shoot guns quite the same way as the men, but they sewed clothing, right? That's a small little action where they were able to save money and not use British goods. And they spread pamphlets and literature against the British. At their little social circles, they would have conversations about the spirit of rebellion. So they weren't bearing arms, but they were participating in rebellion in their own way. All right, the Boston Tea Party, right? Pretty famous event in American history. Let me tell you what's fact, what's fiction, and debunk some of the myths that you might think about the Boston Tea Party. What happens is that the British East India Company has ships loaded with tea in the port of Boston. But the colonists will not let that tea come to port. They will not let that tea come ashore. So you got ships loaded with tea. It is taxed tea. The colonists aren't buying it, and they're not letting it come ashore. Well, December 1773, 3 different groups of men. So that should show that it's a really organized event, right? It's kind of a military precision. 3 different groups of men, 50 men each. They are dressed as Mohawk Indians. And you can do a lot of thinking about why would they take on that disguise. It's basically like they wanted to, 1, hide their own identity, but 2, also maybe kind of try to blame Indians for the action. What's that, Eric?
Smoke screen.
The smoke screen. I like that word, yeah. So Basically 150 men, all dressed like Mohawk Indians. They go into the harbor and they start chucking tea overboard, right? Whole chests of tea. And instead, it's called a tea party because the whole harbor was now saturated with tea. Now, I'm not saying I want to dip a cup of tea out of the Boston Harbor, but I have to think that a lot of the tea actually, dissolved and kind of made the harbor into a darker, murky, almost like a tea party. Yes, TJ?
Actually, you could still taste it's like tea flavor in the harbor up until like the 1980s.
That's impressive. Send me an article on that. I've never read that before, but it sounds reasonable to me, right? So there's a legacy, a long-lasting legacy of the Boston Tea Party. The British demand repayment for this money that has been dumped overboard. We're talking, let's adjust it for today's money, we're talking millions of dollars of product dumped overboard, millions of dollars of tax money lost. So just another picture of what it might have been like. You want to know, I always like the real story, right? Like I said, it wasn't that bag of Lipton iced tea. This is how tea was packaged in the 1770s. Basically, it almost looks like a Hershey bar. And what a family would do is they purchase this chunk of tea, and this small little chunk of compacted tea could last a family for a whole year. What they would do is shave off with a knife, shave off just a little at a time, boil it into a pot of water, and that becomes their tea. And with conservative, with rationing of this block of tea, this chunk of tea could last them a whole year. So these guys weren't dumping tea leaves. They weren't sprinkling ground tea into the harbor. I like to think that they were like frisbee disking these hockey pucks worth of tea into the harbor. I don't know, just a little extra. I think it's really interesting that that's how tea came at that time. Try to find a punctuation mark here real quick. So in response, just go ahead and listen. You guys have already, if you've written down the Boston Tea Party, you can just go ahead and listen. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British government, they go extra. Okay, they go overboard. They close the port of Boston. That's a big economic hit. They reduce Massachusetts self-government. So they close off their assemblies. They close off their elected government. Those who were accused of crimes now had to be transported across the ocean, and they would stand trial in England. So away from your friends and your family, they might never see you again. This is a big deal, right? All of a sudden, we're losing that colonist identity, and the crown is overreaching a lot. And this is already in effect, but the quartering of troops increases. Now they must quarter more troops. Overall, pretty messed up, right? Boston Tea Party definitely has some consequences. This makes those in Boston and those in Massachusetts kind of seen as the example for the rest of the colonies, also seen as martyrs for the rest of the colonies. Hey, look what they're doing up in Boston. Look at how they're getting scuffed up in Boston. We all need to join the revolution like these Bostonians. And overall, it spreads the idea of revolution throughout the colonies. I am going to pause there, and I will pick it up tomorrow. We'll kind of round out events. We'll round out causes and dive right into events. I know I did a lot of talking, but I also hope we had the formative experiences of taxation without representation, and that's something you'll be able to remember as one of the main causes of the American Revolution. So, smack in the middle of Revolution Week, we are on events, we are on causes, and tomorrow we'll actually talk about events of the American Revolution. So keep these notes, you'll pick it up tomorrow. Huzzah! Woo!